Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our wonderful museum. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hold up a blank piece of paper, nice, clean, smooth piece of paper, and I'm going to ask this young man to take it in his hand. Can you come up here? And crumple it up really well, and we'll get back to that later. Okay, now the first thing I always talk about is the topic of Holocaust deniers. There are governments out there, there are people who say the Holocaust never happened. Well, you are now the witnesses. Believe me, the Holocaust happened. I was lucky enough to live through it. But anybody that tells you that the Holocaust did not happen, they are liars. And deniers rhymes with liars, so that's a good way of remembering it. And the other thing is, during the Second World War, Hitler invaded many countries. He took them by force. After the war, the Austrians said that they were also victims. Well, I want to tell you something. I was in Vienna, Austria, in 1938 when Hitler marched into Austria, into Vienna, triumphantly. The same day or the next day, there were people walking around with little swastikas in their lapels, little emblems, and there was large flags flying from many, many buildings. These people were not victims. Many, many of them welcomed them very, very happily. And I'll show you a picture of the streets of Vienna. These were the streets, can you all see this? These were the streets of Vienna. And these are, you hold it up? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, wonderful. So I can assure you he had many, many supporters, and they were not victims. Now I'm going to take you back many, many years, just like this. April of 1939. It is 1 year since Hitler took over Austria. Picture a large railroad station. The train is filled with children. The parents on the platform, some of the grandparents, and they're saying goodbye to their children, not knowing if and when they will ever see them again. Each child had a number around their neck. Now, this was not an engraved number that we talked about earlier. These were just numbers, and they determined where these children were each going to end up. All they knew is that they were going to England. Each child was allowed a little suitcase about this big with all their precious belongings in it. And that was about it. The other thing is, the language in Austria and in Germany is German. These children did not speak a word of English. That in itself is a little frightening, to go to a country where you don't speak the language. Among the children was an 11-year-old girl. Sitting on her lap was her little brother. He was only 7 years old. He was crying bitterly. He had no idea what was happening, why he was leaving his parents. He just couldn't figure this out, and he was very, very scared. And the little girl is holding him on her lap and says, don't worry, now we're going to a land of freedom, and I will always take care of you. Now I'm going to tell you a bit about the little boy, and then I'll get back to it later. The little boy, remember, didn't speak a word of English. At the end of his career, he was a vice president of ABC television news. Pretty nice job for a little boy who didn't know any English. And you've all figured out, of course, I was that little girl. So that was the beginning of my story. Now, how many of you have heard of the Kindertransport? Not, well, a few. Okay, I'll tell you very briefly. Okay, when things started to happen, when Hitler came in, supposedly he wasn't going to kill all the Jews. He just wanted to get rid of them, get them out of the country. Well, that was easier said than done, because, you know, nobody really wanted us, so that it was very, very difficult. If you had a lot of money, you could buy your way out. You turned over everything to the Nazis, and they let you get out somehow. Most people didn't have that kind of money. After Kristallnacht, and you've, I'm sure, heard of Kristallnacht in November of 1938, which was a horrific experience. After Crystal Night, a group of people went to the English government. They were individual people, organizations, Jewish organizations, Quaker, Christian, didn't matter. They went to the English government and they said, look, these people are in terrible danger. We understand you can't let every adult come into our country, but at least let the children come. And so the month after Crystal Night, December of 1938, the first, what they call the Kindertransport, Kinder is children, the first children's transport left for England from Austria and Germany. And that lasted until the war broke out, which is September 1st. And of course it ended there because we were at war. But in that way, 10,000 children were saved. And I'm sure you know that 1.5 million children were killed. So these children were the very, very lucky ones. Now, I was pretty young, but I always asked a lot of questions. And one of my questions was, what is happening? Why are they doing such terrible things to us? Are we criminals? Well, can you see these pictures? The lighting isn't too good. One picture is, of course, of my brother and me when we left Vienna. There's another picture somewhere there. That's the route we took. There's another picture of my parents. Now, do these people look like criminals? I don't think so. They were the most wonderful people that you can imagine. My father was an accountant, my mother was a homemaker, and we had a very, very happy childhood. I will tell you though what led up to all of this. During the First World War, it was a terrible war. Every war is terrible. The First World War, which ended in 1918, Germany and Austria were defeated, and they were defeated very badly, and everything was devastated. There was no food, money meant nothing. A loaf of bread could cost $100. There were no jobs, and people were very, very unhappy and very discontented. And you know yourself, when you're very unhappy about something, you tend to say, why is this happening to me? I didn't do it, it's somebody else's fault. That's what you call finding a scapegoat. Well, Hitler was a crazy man, believe me, but he was a very dynamic speaker. And he came into Germany and he said, listen, German people, you're in terrible shape. You have no food, you have no money, you have no jobs. Isn't your fault? You know whose fault it is? It's all the fault of the Jews. The Jews have money, the Jews riding high. Let's just get rid of the Jews and everything will be much better. And unfortunately, a lot of people believed him and just went along and followed him blindly. As I told you, I grew up in a very loving family, very protective, I have to tell you. As I said, my dad was an accountant, my mother was a homemaker, and we were Austrians. We were totally assimilated Austrians. When I say assimilated, we were part of the Austrian culture, and we just happened to be Jewish. That was, I have to admit, not a major part of my early life. I was very close to my grandparents, and we lived very close to them, and we would go up to visit them many, many times. And my grandfather served in the army, on the Austrian army, during this First World War. And he came home with a case full of medals, and he was so proud of these medals. And just about every time we went up there, my grandfather would say, come, I'll explain the medals to you. And he would tell us all the things he had done, all the bravery to earn those medals. So when things started to happen, my grandfather said, don't worry, they're not going to touch us or me. I'm a decorated war hero. We'll be fine. Well, unfortunately, my grandfather was very wrong. All my grandparents, all my extended family, I had a brilliant young uncle, were all deported, sent to concentration camps and killed. All this bravery didn't help him at all. I had friends, I went to school, we took vacations, and we also had a maid. Now, I want you to understand, you didn't have to be very wealthy to have a maid. Does anybody know what an au pair is in this country? Some of you know. Okay. So, Vienna is and was a very beautiful, romantic city with lots of culture, concerts, opera, plays. And in those days, you could leave school at age 14. Vienna is surrounded by beautiful mountains and farms. And these farm girls at age 14 and a little older would come to Vienna and stay with the family, and they were supposed to help in the household a little bit. Anyhow, I was very, very attached to our maid au pair. Her name was Frida, and we used to play all the time. And my mother would complain and say, Frida's supposed to help me a little bit. All she does is play with you. And I would say, leave us alone, we're having such a good time. Anyhow, the first terrible thing that happened to me in my young life, the day after Hitler came into Austria, Frida had to pack her bag and leave. And I was devastated. Why did she have to leave? Well, no woman under the age of 45 could live in a Jewish household. I don't know what they thought we were doing to her, but she left and I was really very upset. Then it got worse. I went to school and I was, a good kid. Teachers were nice to me. So I walked into my classroom, and Austria is a Catholic country, and every classroom had a huge crucifix excuse me, on the wall. Well, I noticed immediately the crucifix was gone, and in its place was a huge portrait of Hitler. And you were supposed to go and salute that portrait. Well, I hadn't heard such great things about Hitler from my parents, that stuff I'd overheard. So I don't know how smart this was. I decided I'm not going to go and salute him. The next thing that happened was pretty awful. I started talking to my friends. I had Jewish friends, Christian friends, didn't matter. My Christian friends looked at me and they said, don't ever speak to us again. We want nothing to do with you. Can you imagine your best friend saying that to you? And I said, why? We're not in a fight. What did I do? They said, well, you didn't do anything, but you're a dirty Jew, and we want nothing to do with you. And even if we did, our parents would get into trouble, so just forget it. So that was just the beginning. Now, Austria didn't have school buses at that time, so I don't know if they have them now, but the distances were not all that great. My father used to take us to school, and my mother would pick us up after school and take us to one of the parks or the ice skating rink or swimming, just something before we went home. Well, we got to the park, the one we usually went to, and there were big signs on the lawn, and the sign said, no dogs or Jews allowed. So they were putting us on the same level as an animal. But I can tell you they treated their dogs better than they did the Jews. Pretty soon after that, my dad lost his job, and we moved in with my grandparents, which I thought was going to be fabulous because my grandparents spoiled us terribly, which I do with my grandchildren now, because that's a grandmother's role. Anyway, I thought this was going to be fun and games. Well, it wasn't, because even as a child I could sense the tension and the worry and the rumors that were circulated. It was not the fun that I thought it would be. The other thing was we had to turn over any valuables that we had to the Gestapo. Anything, a little ring, anything we had. And if we were lucky enough to leave the country, we had to turn that over to the Nazis. They wouldn't let us go out with anything of any value. I also remember that people started to disappear. Now, I want you to know that the Nazis went after teachers. I mean, not only Jews, many, many other people, including teachers. And we, at that point, went to an all-Jewish school. And some of the teachers all the teachers were Jewish. And some of them would either show up or not show up. And we never knew whether they had been lucky enough to get out of the country or whether they had been imprisoned by the Nazis. And as I said, they went after anybody who did not follow Hitler's crazy doctrine. You didn't have to be Jewish to be persecuted. Well, as I say, it was a very tense time, and people were very worried. But you know, sometimes when you don't want to face the situation, you don't really see it. And my parents kept rationalizing and saying, well, this man is crazy, which he was. This can't last. Something will happen. There's still Jews living in Germany. Something will change. Well, something did change, and it was a terrible, terrible change for the worse. It was Crystal Night, and I'm sure you've all read about that, when the Nazis launched a horrible pogrom during the night. They arrested hundreds and hundreds of Jewish men. In those days, they went after the men. They broke into every temple and synagogue. They set them on fire. They took our sacred books, our Torahs, our prayer books. They tore them up. They trampled them and threw them out in the street. It was just horrible. They also tried to identify every Jewish shop, and they smashed the windows and looted the stores and just left everything in shambles. So that went on during the night. Now I'm going to tell you something you're not going to believe. I grew up without television. Television had not been invented. Can you imagine? So, and they had one radio station. It was controlled by the Nazis. So we were fortunate that night. Nothing happened to us. We didn't know anything. And so my dad and my little brother and I went downstairs, and we tried to open the door just to the sidewalk. We couldn't even open the door. Everything was absolutely in shambles. There was glass, broken glass everywhere, on the pavement, on the street. It was a horrific sight. But the worst part of it is something that I will never forget. I'm going to show you what I saw. This is a picture of hundreds of men. They're on their hands and knees. I'm going to get my assistant again. Thank you.
Got it.
Yeah. These poor men were on their hands and knees with little scrub brushes in their hands. Standing over them were the black-shirted SS and the brown-shirted SR. And they had whips in their hands. And if these poor men didn't clean up the mess that the Nazis had made, if they didn't do it fast enough, they just cracked their whips. And the other thing that was horrific was the bystanders. There are people standing around. They're grinning and smirking and laughing. That was their morning's entertainment. And I remember I adored my father. And I looked at my dad and I said, "Dad, can't you do something?" And my father shook his head. I'll never forget it. He said, "There's nothing I can do." When my parents came to me, because my brother was too young, they came to me the next month and they said, "We've heard about the Kindertransport. Would you and Walter go on the train to England? We will try and follow you, but we'd like you to get to a safer place." And I said, "Yes, absolutely, I want to get out of here." And so that, as I said, that day determined the rest of my life. And it really changed my life forever. And I was, well, 11 years old. My parents did try to get out as a family, and we just were not able to do it. But I've always said that my parents gave birth to us twice. The first time when we were born, and the second time when they had the courage and the foresight to put us on their train to safety. So we went to England, and everybody has a different experience. As I said, there were 10,000 of us, and we had an organization, so we used to meet every year or every other year, and I met quite a few of them, and every child had a different story. Some were treated fantastically well. Others were actually abused. Walter and I were somewhere in the middle. We were treated very well. We got a good education, but we were shifted around a lot. I can't even tell you how many schools we went to. We started off in the eastern part of England when the Nazis invaded France and they started bombing and shelling from France. We were evacuated to the western part of England, which was much, much safer. So at that point we were refugees and evacuees. We lived with families. We were treated well, and as I said, we got a very good education. And talking of that, I'll interject it right now. As I mentioned, Hitler took away all of our worldly belongings, anything we own. But the one thing nobody can ever take away from you is your education. That is the most important thing, and I can't urge you enough to make the most of your education. My brother did, and he did very well. So I have been luckier than many, many other people. We got to England in April of 1939. My father was able to come to England in June of 1939. I told you he was an accountant and he worked in an international bank, and the bank was able to get some of their top people out, and they were given a choice of England or France. Of course, my father chose England because we were there. Unfortunately, the people who chose France, when the Nazis invaded France, most of them were deported and killed. But my father was very, very lucky to get to England. However, that wasn't all that great. First of all, he couldn't live with us. He had no income, and he lived in a little boarding house, and we'd see him once a week, and that was the highlight of our week. Well, soon after the war broke out, and I've never blamed the English for doing this, but they arrested every what they called enemy alien. You know, England is a small island. It was overrun by German spies, and the government didn't know who was a German spy and who was an Austrian refugee or German refugee. So they arrested all these men and they put them in camps. Now these were not extermination camps, but they were real prisons. And my father, again, was one of the lucky ones. He was sent to the Isle of Man, and he spent 2 years isolated, you know, away from us on the Isle of Man. The worst thing that really occurred there was the fact that the guys were so bored, they had nothing to do. And my dad happened to be a championship chess player. So he started to play chess, and he started teaching some of the other people chess. And he played chess all his life. And many years later, my parents moved to Clearwater, where I've lived for many, many years. And my dad became the chess coach for Clearwater High School. And they won a lot of tournaments. So there's always a silver lining. My mother was supposed to come to England. Her papers were lost. I can't even tell you what happened. Bottom line, the war broke out and she was trapped in Vienna. And at that point, we couldn't even communicate with her because we were at war. So we somehow sent some letters via Switzerland. It was very complicated. Then another miracle happened. My dad had a cousin, a distant cousin in New York, who knew some people who were very well-to-do. And she went to these people and said, would you send these people an affidavit? An affidavit is just a piece of paper that says, let this family come to our country, to the United States. They will not be a burden to the government. We will take care of them. Now that was a wonderful thing for this family. They didn't know us and this family of four, you know. They never had to take care of any of us, but my mother, with this piece of paper, was able to come to the United States in May of 1940, and that piece of paper saved her life. She was on probably the last ship that left Europe. After that, Europe was closed. It was very, very difficult. But she worked from the minute she got here, and they didn't have to support us. Now, we were separated from my mother for 6 years. As I said, I've been very fortunate. The Nazis certainly robbed me of my childhood, that's for sure. But we were able to come to New York, to the United States, in January of 1945. We left England in December 44, got here in 1945. And we were reunited as a family, my brother, myself, my mother and father. Now that sounds like the end of a wonderful story. Well, I have to admit to you, it wasn't so wonderful. I actually have some pictures. If some of you want to look at them afterwards, I can show them to you. I don't have them enlarged yet. I was 11 years old when I left my mother. I had my 17th birthday on the ship. I was totally grown up. I had taken care of everything. I was an adult. I was also 5'7", and my mother was 5'2". All of a sudden, this little woman is telling me what to do. I was a terrible teenager. I gave her a very hard time. But I made up for it in later years. I was a very good daughter. I realized how difficult it had been for my mother. So now I'm going to tell you the best part of my story. My mother was all alone in New York City, very lonely, very unhappy, and she was walking in downtown Manhattan one day, which that's a big place, and whom should she see but her best friend from high school. Now this was a family who had a lot of money in Vienna. They were very well to do. They had a huge business. The father was imprisoned right away. He was not in a camp, but he was in a prison. And in order to get him out after two or 3 months, they had to sign over everything to the Nazis. Their business, their apartment. Anybody see the movie Woman in Gold? Not yet. It's a very good movie. My husband's family lived in that apartment house. Very fancy. Anyhow, they had to get rid of, they got rid of everything and left with just the mother and father and the son and the daughter. And they were living in New York, and they said, Martha was her name, said to my mother, "You're going to be part of our family now. You're going to celebrate holidays and birthdays and whatever." So when we came over, and that's what happened, when we came over, my mother said, "The first family we're going to visit is this family because they've been so wonderful to me." So we did that, and I met the mother and the father and the daughter, who was about my age, and we clicked immediately. We really took to each other and became great friends. The son was not at home. He was in the American Army, and it was towards the end of the war, but he was still in the service. And then after that, he went to college and to medical school in upstate New York, so he wasn't around very much. But I became great friends with his sister. So one day, a couple of years later, Elliot, my sister-in-law, called me up. She said, "My brother's going to be in town this weekend. Would you like to meet him? He's the only one you've never met." And my mother said to me, because not that I ever listened to my mother, but this time I listened, she said, "You can't turn him down. If he calls you, you better go out on a date with him." I said, "Okay, I'll do it." So I did it. And does anybody want to guess what happened?
You got married.
We got married. Not immediately, a year later. And I told you I've been very lucky. I met this wonderful, wonderful man that I was married to for 45 years. We have 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, who are all involved in this museum. I have 12 grandchildren. I have a six-month-old great-grandchild. It's the love of my life. And I'm expecting another great-grandchild in a couple of weeks. So I always say that I personally defeated Hitler. Anyway, I do want you to keep in mind that Hitler, as I said earlier, did not only go after Jews. Anybody that didn't agree with him, with his crazy ideas, wouldn't fit into his concept. Gypsies, gays, mentally retarded, physically handicapped. It's just, he was absolutely crazy. One of the other things he wanted to do, he wanted to create a German master race. He wanted everybody to have white skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair. That is the most ridiculous thing. My hair changes every week. That's not important. It's what's in your heart. That's what's important. Now I'm going to quote Albert Einstein. He said, "The world is a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it," the bystanders. There are 3 types of people. There are the victims, bad things happen to them. There are the perpetrators, the ones that carry out the bad things. And then there are the bystanders. They see bad things happen and do nothing about it. And that brings me to the subject of bullying. And now, can you have this piece of paper, please? Can you open it up? Okay, perfect. Can we hold it up? That's okay. That's close enough. Okay, can I have it? Thank you. Okay, is this the same piece of paper that I held up earlier?
No.
Of course not. It has been badly damaged. And that's what happens when you bully somebody. That person is damaged forever. It doesn't matter whether you do it on the computer or in person, or if you say that you're sorry afterwards. That person has been damaged. You look like a great group of young people. I know you're not going to bully anybody. But if you see something happen, don't be a bystander. Do something about it. Tell a parent, tell a teacher, tell anybody who can help you. But the worst thing you can do is be a bystander. And after visiting this museum, I'm sure you will not be bystanders. Elie Wiesel, the most famous Holocaust survivor that we know, and he won a Nobel Peace Prize, said, "The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference." That's the same thing. You will not be indifferent. You will speak up and you will see the terrible consequences of hatred and racism and everything else that is not good. Now I'm going to come to a very sad part of my life. And I'll go back to my brother. My brother obviously was a very smart man. When he was a teenager, he started to smoke. At that time, it was not known that smoking is so bad for your health. When the Surgeon General came out with the edict that you should not smoke, he stopped smoking immediately. 20 years after he stopped smoking, he developed lung cancer. And he died quite a few years ago. And to me, you know, I always took care of him. I always told him that I was absolutely responsible for all his success, which was not true. And I always gave him advice, which he didn't take. But, you know, I was very, very close to him. And that was a terrible thing that happened. And my advice to you is don't smoke. Don't try drugs. It'll catch up with you in the long run. And as I said before, value your education. Walter was a very good student, and he progressed, and he really did everything right. And so what I also want to say as far as his career, you can overcome adversity. Bad things happen all the time. You can't help it. There are divorces, you have to move. All sorts of things can happen at home. But stick to your education. You can overcome anything bad. Just reach for the stars and you will get there. And as I say, Walter did. Other than that, it is definitely you are our future. You are our hope. You're going to make this a really good world, better than it is now. And our museum's aim is to wipe out hatred and racism and bigotry. And you will be able to do that. Thank you so much. You've been a great audience. I appreciate it. Anybody have any questions? No questions? I must have covered everything. Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. I'm thinking of a different person.
Okay. No questions at all? Okay.
Did you ever have a time in your life where you thought you weren't going to see your parents again?
Did I ever have a time in my life when I thought what?
You weren't going to see your parents again.
That I would not see my parents again. Well, I was always hopeful. I'm a very positive person. To me, my glass is always half full. So I was, and once my mother came to the United States, we were able to write to her. So I was pretty confident that we would see them again. If I hadn't, I know quite a few people who never saw their parents again, and they are, well, I want to say damaged, that's probably not the right word, but that is something, you can't get over that. I still mourn my grandparents very, very much. And one reason I love this museum is that I feel I'm repaying what they suffered and doing something, so this will never ever happen again. That's our motto. never again. Somebody else had their hand up, yes.
After you were transported, did you openly talk about what had happened with the people that you met?
Oh, after? Say that again, after?
Soon after you were transported, did you openly talk about what had happened?
After we were transported, did we talk about it? I want to tell you something really interesting. For the first maybe 20 years, we didn't talk about it much at all. I certainly didn't talk about it with my mother. It was very, very painful for her. And most people didn't talk about it. And then maybe in the 1980s, would I be right on that? But in the 1980s, people started to talk about the Holocaust, and more and more and more. And books were written and movies were made. And so it took a while for people to kind of recover from that shock, I think. Wait a minute, there was a hand up.
Do you have like numbers on your arm, like
See that?
numbers?
Because she never went to a concentration camp. She was on the Kindertransport to go to England.
Yeah. So I had a number on my neck, but not
Badge.
no.
When you mentioned about how Hitler was killing anyone with like mental or physical handicap, did that include people with ADHD?
Well, somebody repeat the question because I don't hear.
He says when Hitler was
When Hitler?
taking people who were disabled,
Yes.
he said, he asked, does that include people who had ADHD? ADHD wasn't something that was recognized.
Yeah.
No.
Oh, the question was when Hitler went after the disabled people, he wanted to know whether they targeted ADHD. ADHD. You know, he wasn't that specific. Anybody who was disabled in any way did not fit into his schema what he wanted the German master race to look like. They had to be perfect in his eyes. And yeah, and you'll have to repeat the question because.
How long did it take for you to learn English?
How long did it take for me to learn English? Not long at all, because nobody in the boarding school spoke German. So I had to, and children learn languages very quickly, you know, I was exposed to it, so we learned it very quickly. I will tell you, because I'm often asked that question, yes, I still speak German. I have very few people I can speak it with anymore, but I still speak German. My brother, who spoke perfect English without a trace of an accent, never spoke German again. He understood it. My parents would speak German to him and he answered in English. So I think it's the difference in the age. He was younger than I, so he didn't really remember German as well as I do.
Have you ever visited the Holocaust Museum in D.C.?
Have I ever visited the Holocaust Museum in D.C.? Yes, I have. And it's a phenomenal experience.
While you were living in England, did you ever open a bank account?
When I was living in England, did I open a bank account? No, I did not. I actually had no money to put in a bank account.
I'm just wondering, could you like demonstrate like a German sentence or
Can I demonstrate German sentences? Well, if Elias was there, I would talk to him, but he's not in the room, I don't think. Ich bin sehr froh, dass ihr alle hier seid und ich hoffe, dass es euch gut gefallen hat. Which means I'm very happy that you all came to this museum and I hope you enjoyed your visit. Ist hier. Elias ist hier. Können wir zusammen sprechen? Anything else? Well, thank you again so much. You've been terrific. Thank you.